The crystal ornament slipped from Margaret's fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor of what she believed was her son's house. The sound echoed through the tension-thick silence that had descended over our Christmas Eve gathering like a funeral shroud. "You're not welcome here," she screamed, her perfectly coiffed silver hair trembling with rage as she pointed a manicured finger at me. "This is my son's house, and I won't have some gold digger ruining our family Christmas." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I stood frozen by the 8-foot Fraser fir that I had personally selected, decorated, and paid for, watching as 23 years of careful pretense crumbled around me like the shards of that ornament. The tree's warm lights cast dancing shadows across the faces of my husband David's extended family, 15 people who had spent the last hour treating me like an unwelcome stranger in my own home. David said nothing. He never did, his silence cut deeper than his mother's venom ever could. While Margaret continued her tirade about how I'd trapped her precious son with my scheming ways, I found myself studying the crown molding I'd had installed last spring. The Italian marble floors I'd chosen. The custom chandelier hanging above us that had cost more than most people made in a year. Every single thing in this house, from the foundation to the gold-leafed ceiling medallions, belonged to me. Not us. Me. "Look at her," Margaret spat, her voice dripping with disdain. "Standing there like she owns the place. Probably calculating how much she can squeeze out of David when she inevitably leaves him for someone richer. If only she knew. My name is Elena Vasquez, though for the past 5 years, I've been known as Elena Morrison. To most of the world, I'm a simple accountant who got lucky and married above her station. To David's family, I'm the woman who stole their golden boy from his rightful destiny with Cynthia Blackwood, old money royalty and Margaret's chosen daughter-in-law. What none of them know, what I've spent half a decade carefully concealing, is that I'm the founder and sole owner of Meridian Holdings, a private equity firm worth $2.3 billion. The modest Toyota Camry in our garage? Up. The department store clothes I wear to family gatherings? Theater costumes. The nervous, grateful act I perform whenever Margaret criticizes everything from my common background to my career choices? Pure performance art. I built my empire from nothing, starting with a $500 loan and an idea that the venture capital boys dismissed as too ambitious for a girl from the wrong side of town. I proved them wrong, acquiring company after company, building a portfolio that spans 3 continents. Forbes doesn't know my real name. I've maintained my privacy through layers of shell companies and NDAs that would make the CIA jealous. The only person who knows the truth is my assistant, Marcus, and my lawyer, Patricia. Even David believes. I work as a staff accountant at Henderson and Associates, a firm I actually own through 6 degrees of corporate separation. Are you even listening to me? Margaret's shrill voice snapped me back to the present. She had moved closer, her Botoxed face twisted into a mask of disgust. "I said you need to leave. Now. This is a family Christmas, and you," she looked me up and down with theatrical revulsion, "are not family." The room held its breath. David's sister Jennifer shifted uncomfortably on the Italian leather sofa I'd had shipped from Milan. His brother Robert suddenly found his phone fascinating. Uncle Thomas, who had spent dinner lecturing me about knowing my place, studied his brandy snifter like it contained the secrets of the universe. Still, David said nothing. I felt something crack inside my chest, not my heart, that had been broken by his cowardice years ago, but something else. Something that had been holding back a truth too big for this charade. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Margaret," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening in my soul. "I need to tell you something. I don't care what. This house," I continued, speaking over her objections, "is mine." The room went silent except for the crackling of the fireplace I'd had installed with a custom Italian stone surround. "The mortgage is in my name. The deed is in my name. The insurance, the property taxes, the utilities, all mine." I looked around the room, meeting each shocked gaze. "David doesn't own so much as a doorknob in this place." Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "That's impossible," Jennifer whispered. "David told us he bought this house after his promotion at Morrison and Associates?" I smiled, feeling a weight I'd carried for years beginning to lift. The law firm where he's a junior partner? I walked to the antique writing desk, a piece I'd acquired at a Sotheby's auction last year, and pulled out a leather portfolio I'd placed there earlier, just in case this moment ever came. Morrison and Associates is owned by Blackstone Legal Group, I said, opening the portfolio and removing documents I'd had prepared months ago. Blackstone is owned by Meridian Holdings. Meridian Holdings is owned by Elena Vasquez, that's me, in case anyone's confused. The silence stretched so long I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. David doesn't just work for me, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. His paycheck comes from my company. This house, the cars, the credit cards he uses, the country club membership Margaret loves to brag about, it's all mine. Margaret's face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. That's not possible. David would have told us. He would have told you what? I asked, walking closer to her. That he married his boss? That every success he's celebrated, every promotion, every raise came because I arranged it? That the man you think is such a catch has been living off his wife's money for 5 years? David finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. Elena, what are you doing? I turned to face my husband, the man I'd loved enough to hide my true self from, to pretend to be smaller, weaker, more dependent than I was. The man who had just stood silent while his mother tried to throw me out of my own home. I'm done pretending, David. I'm done making myself small so your family can feel big. I'm done letting your mother treat me like trash in the house I built with my own money. But why? Jennifer's voice was barely audible. Why would you hide this? I thought about the early days with David, how he'd seemed different from the other men I'd dated. How he'd claimed to love me for who I was, not what I had. How he'd insisted on that prenup to protect both of us, never knowing he was actually protecting my billions from his potential claims. Because I wanted to be loved for myself, I said simply. Not my money. The irony was bitter as dark chocolate. In hiding my wealth, I discovered that David didn't love the real me at all. He loved the idea of being my savior, my provider, my superior. He loved feeling like the successful one in our relationship. Margaret had sunk into the armchair, my $15,000 custom armchair, looking shell-shocked. This can't be happening. Oh, but it is. I pulled out my phone and opened the banking app that showed my personal accounts. Would you like to see the receipts, Margaret? For this house? For David's car? For the jewelry you complimented me on earlier, the pieces you assumed he bought me? I scrolled through the transactions, each one a nail in the coffin of their assumptions. The pearl necklace? Tiffany, $47,000, purchased by me. David's Rolex? Bucherer, $23,000, my credit card. The vacation to Tuscany you've been bragging about to your bridge club? $35,000, funded entirely by your son's wife, the woman you just tried to kick out of her own home. Robert had gone completely white. Elena, we didn't know, of course you didn't know, I said, my patience finally evaporating. Because none of you ever bothered to actually get to know me. You saw a woman from a modest background who married into your family, and you assumed I was lucky to be here. You never asked about my work, my interests, my dreams. You just decided I was beneath you and treated me accordingly. Margaret was crying now, her carefully applied mascara leaving black tracks down her cheeks. David, tell her she's lying. Tell her this is some kind of joke. David looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of shock, betrayal, and something that might have been fear. Is it true? He whispered. All of it? Every word. The company I work for. You really own it? I've owned it for 3 years. I bought it specifically because I wanted to give you opportunities to advance. Every promotion, every raise, every merit-based recognition you've received since we got married came because I arranged it. The grandfather clock chimed midnight, announcing the official arrival of Christmas Day. How fitting that this should be the moment everything changed. I need some air, David said, stumbling toward the front door. David, wait. Margaret called after him, but he was already gone, the door slamming behind him with enough force to rattle the Waterford crystal in the dining room hutch. I looked around at the remaining family members, people who had spent years making me feel unwelcome in my own home, who had questioned my worthiness to bear their family name, who had treated me like an interloper in their precious bloodline. So, I said, my voice steady and clear. Anyone else have questions about whether I belong here? The silence was answer enough, but as I watched them struggle to process this revelation, I realized this was only the beginning. 23 years of assumptions don't crumble in a single conversation. Margaret's humiliation tonight was just the opening act. Tomorrow, I would have to decide what came next. Whether this marriage could survive the death of the illusion that had sustained it. Whether David could love the real me, or only the fiction he'd fallen for, and most importantly, whether I was ready to stop hiding and start living as the woman I'd always been, with or without the family that was about to discover they'd been spectacularly wrong about everything they thought they knew. The Christmas tree lights twinkled mockingly as I began to clean up the shattered ornament, each glittering fragment a piece of the life I was about to leave behind. I woke Christmas morning to the sound of hushed, frantic whispers drifting up from the kitchen. The space beside me in our king-sized bed was cold and untouched. David hadn't come home. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our master bedroom, I could see his tire tracks in the circular driveway where he'd peeled out at midnight, disturbing. The pristine snow that had fallen during Margaret's theatrical breakdown. My phone showed 17 missed calls from David, 12 from Margaret, and 43 text messages ranging from desperate apologies to demands for explanations. I ignored them all, instead pulling up the security system app that monitored every inch of my property. The cameras revealed the source of the morning's commotion: Margaret, Jennifer, and Robert huddled around my granite kitchen island like conspirators plotting a coup. I slipped into my silk robe, La Perla, though they'd assume it was Target, and padded barefoot down the curved staircase I'd imported from a 16th-century Italian palazzo. The conversation stopped abruptly when I appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Good morning," I said pleasantly, moving toward my $3,000 espresso machine. "Coffee, anyone?" The three of them exchanged glances that could have powered the Christmas lights still twinkling throughout the house. Margaret looked like she'd aged a decade overnight, her usually perfect appearance disheveled and desperate. Jennifer clutched her phone like a lifeline, while Robert kept checking his watch as if he could somehow rewind time to before last night's revelations. "Elena," Margaret began, her voice hoarse from what I assumed had been hours of crying. "We need to talk." "I'm listening." I programmed the machine for a double espresso, savoring the familiar ritual of my morning routine while my world imploded around me. "This is all some kind of misunderstanding," Jennifer said quickly. "You can't really own everything you claimed last night. It's not possible." I pulled out my phone and opened the real estate app that tracked my property portfolio. "Would you like to see the other houses?" I asked casually. "The penthouse in Manhattan? The vineyard in Napa? The estate in the Hamptons where you all stayed last summer, the one you assumed David was renting?" Robert's face went gray. "You own the Hampton house too?" "I own 17 properties across 4 states, I replied, taking my first sip of coffee. "Last night I only mentioned the ones you've personally enjoyed at my expense." Margaret's composure finally cracked completely. "Why would you do this to us? Why would you let us believe David was successful on his own? Why would you humiliate us like this?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. I studied her face, seeing for the first time not the imperious matriarch who'd terrorized me for years, but a frightened old woman whose entire worldview had collapsed in a single evening. "Margaret," I said quietly, "I didn't do anything to you. I simply stopped protecting you from the truth." "But David's career is real," I interrupted. "He's actually quite good at his job. The promotions I arranged? He earned them by performing well in positions I made available to him. I didn't buy him success, I bought him opportunities." Jennifer looked up from her phone, where she'd apparently been frantically Googling. "I can't find any Elena Vasquez associated with Meridian Holdings." "Of course you can't. Privacy is expensive, but I can afford it." I moved to the kitchen island, spreading out documents I'd retrieved from my home safe. Shell companies, trust funds, international holding corporations. When you have enough money, you can make yourself essentially invisible. Robert leaned forward, studying the papers with the desperate intensity of a man watching his assumptions die. "This says you're worth $2.3 billion, yes. Though that fluctuates with market conditions." I sipped my coffee, watching their faces process numbers that most people couldn't comprehend. I started with $500 and a business plan that 12 male investors told me was too ambitious for someone like me. Turns out they were wrong. The kitchen fell silent except for the soft hum of Sub-Zero refrigerator, another purchase they'd assumed was David's success made manifest. Margaret's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, and her face crumbled further. David's at the Ritz-Carlton downtown. He's asking if what you said is true. Then tell him yes. I met her eyes steadily. Tell him everything he thought he knew about his life was a carefully constructed illusion designed to protect his ego. That's cruel, Jennifer whispered. Is it? I asked. Was it cruel when you spent Thanksgiving explaining to me how lucky I was that David took a chance on someone from my background? Was it cruel when Margaret told everyone at the country club that I was sweet but simple? Was it cruel when Robert suggested I might be happier with women like me instead of attending charity galas? The memories poured out like water through a broken dam. Years of subtle humiliations, of being patted on the head and dismissed, of watching them treat me like David's charity case while I funded their lifestyle. We were trying to help you fit in, Margaret protested weakly. By making me feel like I didn't belong? By constantly reminding me that I wasn't good enough for your family. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Margaret, do you remember the conversation we had at Easter? When you suggested I might want to aim lower in my career aspirations. She had the grace to look ashamed. I had just closed a deal that netted my company $300 million in profit. While you were lecturing me about being more realistic, I was sitting on an acquisition that would make me richer than everyone at your bridge club combined. My phone rang, Marcus, my assistant, calling with his usual impeccable timing. I answered on speaker. Elena, I hope I'm not interrupting Christmas morning, but the Yamamoto deal just closed. Congratulations, you now own the largest semiconductor manufacturing chain in Southeast Asia. The three family members stared at me as I thanked Marcus and hung up. $1.2 billion acquisition, I explained conversationally. I've been working on it for 8 months. David thinks I've been stressed about a quarterly review at the accounting firm. Robert was the first to find his voice. Elena, we had no idea. If you'd known I had money, you would have treated me differently. I shook my head. That's exactly the problem, Robert. I shouldn't have needed billions of dollars to earn basic human decency from my husband's family. Jennifer's phone buzzed with a text. She read it and looked up with wide eyes. David wants to know if you're going to divorce him. The question I'd been avoiding all night finally surfaced. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gardens I'd had professionally landscaped, thinking about the 5 years I'd spent playing a role that had slowly suffocated my authentic self. I don't know, I said honestly. I married David because I thought he was different. Because when I met him, he seemed to care about who I was, not what I had. But last night, when your mother was screaming at me to leave my own house, he said nothing. When she called me a gold digger, he stood silent. When she tried to humiliate me in front of everyone, he protected his own comfort instead of his wife. Margaret was crying again, mascara-free tears that made her look human for the first time in years. Elena, please. We can fix this. We can start over. Can we? I turned back to face them. Because here's what I learned last night, David doesn't love me. He loves the idea of being my provider, my superior, my rescuer. He loves feeling like the successful one in our relationship. The man I married fell in love with a fiction. The weight of that realization settled over the kitchen like a lead blanket. What happens now? Robert asked quietly. I thought about the prenup David had insisted on, meant to protect his assets from a woman he saw as his financial inferior. I thought about the empire I'd built in secret, the companies I owned, the lives I'd transformed through business decisions made while pretending to be a simple accountant. Now, I said, we find out who we all really are when the masks come off. My phone buzzed with another text from David, coming home. We need to talk. I showed them the message. Well, looks like the conversation is about to get interesting. Margaret stood up abruptly, smoothing her wrinkled clothes. We should go. Give you two privacy. Should you? I asked. This is your family's crisis too. David's success, his lifestyle, his ability to support the family image you're so proud of, it all depends on staying married to me. The implications hit them like physical blows. If I divorced David, he'd lose everything: the house, the cars, the country club membership, the job I'd arranged for him. He'd lose the life they'd all bragged about to their social circles. You wouldn't? Jennifer began. Wouldn't what? Take back my own money? Reclaim my own property? Stop funding a lifestyle for people who treat me like an unwelcome stranger. I heard David's key in the front door, followed by his hesitant footsteps across the marble foyer. He appeared in the kitchen doorway looking like he'd aged years in a single night, his usually perfect hair disheveled, his clothes wrinkled from sleeping in his car. Elena, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. David. The family watched this exchange like spectators at a tennis match, heads turning between us as we sized each other up across the ruins of our marriage. Is it true? He asked. All of it? Every word. He slumped against the doorframe as if the confirmation had physically struck him. The house, the company, everything? Everything. Why? The single word carried the weight of 5 years of deception. Why would you lie to me about who you are? I set down my coffee cup with deliberate precision. I didn't lie, David. I simply didn't correct your assumptions. When we met, you decided I was a struggling accountant, and I let you believe it because I thought you'd fallen in love with me, not my bank account. But you let me think I was providing for you. You let me feel like I was taking care of you. Yes, I said simply. Because you needed to feel that way, and I loved you enough to let you. The truth hung between us like a bridge neither of us was ready to cross. Margaret, Jennifer, and Robert watched this exchange with the horrified fascination of people witnessing a car accident in slow motion. Their carefully constructed family narrative was crumbling in real time, and they were powerless to stop it. What happens now? David echoed his brother's earlier question. I looked around the kitchen, my kitchen, at the people who had spent years making me feel like an intruder in my own life. I thought about the woman I'd been before I married David, confident and successful and unashamed of her achievements. I thought about the woman I'd become, smaller and quieter and perpetually grateful for acceptance I shouldn't have needed to earn. Now, I said, we decide whether this marriage can survive the death of the illusion that created it. The silence that followed was pregnant with possibilities, none of them comfortable. Outside, snow continued to fall on the grounds of the estate I'd built with my own success, covering the tire tracks David had left in his flight from the truth. But there was no covering the tracks of the conversation that was about to determine all our futures. Christmas morning had never felt less holy. The silence stretched until David's phone shattered it with an incoming call. The name, Cynthia Blackwood, flashed across the screen, and I watched my husband's face cycle through guilt, panic, and something that looked suspiciously like relief. Aren't you going to answer? I asked, though I already knew the answer would reveal more than any conversation we might have had. David declined the call, but not before Margaret's eyes lit up with a hope that made my stomach turn. The matriarch who had spent the night crying over her shattered assumptions was suddenly calculating new possibilities. Cynthia's been calling all morning, Margaret said, attempting nonchalance and failing spectacularly. She heard there was some kind of situation. What kind of situation? I asked, though I suspected I knew exactly. What story was making its way through their social circle? Jennifer shifted uncomfortably. There might have been some talk at the Hendersons' Christmas party last night. About David leaving suddenly. About you two having problems. I pulled out my phone and opened the social media monitoring app that tracked mentions of my various business interests. What I found made me laugh, a sound so cold it seemed to drop the kitchen temperature by 10 degrees. Problems, I repeated, scrolling through posts from last night's party. Is that what we're calling it when Margaret Hamilton posts on Facebook about her ungrateful daughter-in-law finally showing her true colors? Margaret's face went white. Elena, I was upset. I wasn't thinking clearly. Oh, but you were thinking clearly, I said, turning my phone screen toward them. Clear enough to text Cynthia Blackwood at 2:47 a.m. with updates about David's marital difficulties. Clear enough to call your sister Helen at dawn to discuss how this might be David's second chance at happiness with the right kind of woman. The phone records were all there, archived automatically by security systems I'd had installed to protect my business interests. I'd never imagined I'd need them to monitor my own family's betrayal. David's phone rang again. Cynthia, persistently calling back. David, I said quietly, why don't you take that call? I'm sure Cynthia has very important things to discuss with you about your newfound availability. Elena, it's not what you think, isn't it? I stood up, walking to the kitchen counter where I'd left the documents from my safe. Let me tell you what I think, David. I think your mother spent the night orchestrating damage control that assumes this marriage is over. I think she's already planning your reunion with the woman she actually wanted you to marry. And I think you're seriously considering it. The accuracy of my assessment was written across his face like a confession. You want to know the really ironic part? I continued, pulling out a folder I hadn't shown them the night before. Cynthia Blackwood, old money princess, suitable wife material, Margaret's preferred daughter-in-law? She's broke. The collective intake of breath was audible. The Blackwood fortune evaporated 3 years ago in a series of spectacularly bad investments. The family's been leveraging their reputation to maintain appearances, but they're leveraged to the hilt. The estate is mortgaged, the trust funds are empty, and Daddy's currently under SEC investigation for securities fraud. I spread out the financial documents my investigators had compiled. Cynthia's been looking for a wealthy husband to save her family from bankruptcy. Margaret's been pushing David toward a woman who needs a financial rescue just as desperately as Margaret thought. I did. Margaret stared at the papers as if they might catch fire. That's impossible. The Blackwoods are one of the oldest families in the state. Old doesn't mean solvent, I replied. In fact, Cynthia's been quite strategic about her interest in David. She's been positioning herself as his fallback option for months, haven't you noticed? The casual drop-ins, the invitations to family events, the concerned calls about his marriage problems. David's phone buzzed with a text. He read it and his face went even paler. What does she want? I asked. She says she heard we're separating. She wants to have lunch this week to catch up as old friends. How thoughtful, I said dryly. I'm sure her timing is purely coincidental. Robert, who had been silent through this revelation, finally spoke. Elena, even if what you're saying about Cynthia is true, you can't expect David to just pretend nothing has changed between you two. Can't I? I turned to face my brother-in-law directly. Tell me, Robert, what exactly has changed? Am I a different person than I was yesterday? Have I somehow become less worthy of respect because you discovered I'm successful? You lied to us, Jennifer interjected. For 5 years, you let us believe, I let you believe what you wanted to believe, I cut her off. When I met David, I told him I worked in finance. That was true. When you asked about my job, I said I handled investments. Also true. When Margaret questioned whether I could keep up with your family's lifestyle, I said I thought I'd manage. Entirely accurate. I moved to the coffee machine for a refill, giving them time to process the distinction between deception and allowing assumptions to stand uncorrected. The difference, I continued, is that you all needed me to be smaller than I am. You needed me to be grateful for David's attention, lucky to be included in your family, blessed to live in his house. You created a version of me that fit your narrative, and I was foolish enough to let you. My phone chimed with an urgent notification. Marcus again, but this time it wasn't about business, it was personal security. Elena, his voice was tight. With concern when I answered. We've detected some unusual activity. Someone's been making inquiries about your identity. Professional inquiries. I felt the first cold finger of real fear trace down my spine. What kind of inquiries? Financial background checks, property searches, corporate database diving. Whoever it is has resources and knows what they're looking for. I glanced at the family watching me with varying degrees of confusion and concern. How long? Started. About 3 hours ago. Right after certain social media posts began circulating. Margaret's late-night Facebook tirade. Her calls to Helen. The gossip network that connected their entire social circle. Thank you, Marcus. Initiate Protocol 7. I hung up and found 4 pairs of eyes staring at me with new worry. What was that about? David asked. That was about the consequences of making our private business public, I said, looking directly at Margaret. Apparently, your social media announcements last night caught someone's attention. Someone with enough resources to start digging into my background. The implications hit Margaret like a physical blow. Elena, I'm sorry. I was just so upset. Sorry doesn't unring the bell, I interrupted. My privacy, my security, my carefully constructed anonymity, it's all been compromised because you couldn't keep our family drama off Facebook. David's phone rang again. This time it was his law firm. Morrison, he answered, then listened for a long moment. His face went through several color changes before he hung up. What? Jennifer demanded. That was senior partner Williams. He wants to see me first thing tomorrow morning. There are questions about my family situation and how it might affect my position at the firm. The irony was almost too perfect. David's job, the one I'd arranged for him at the firm I owned, was now in jeopardy because his family couldn't handle the truth about their benefactor. They're worried about scandal, I translated. A junior partner whose personal life is splashed across social media doesn't look good for the firm's reputation. Can they fire him for this? Robert asked. I thought about the employment contracts I'd had my lawyers draft, the careful protections I'd built in for David without his knowledge. Not for his marital status. But they can question his judgment, his discretion, his suitability for handling sensitive client matters. David looked stricken. Elena, you have to fix this. Talk to Williams. Explain that. Explain what? I asked quietly. That your wife owns the firm and can override his concerns? That would certainly solve the immediate problem while creating much larger ones. The kitchen fell silent as they all contemplated the web of complications my revelation had created. David's career hung in the balance. Margaret's social standing was built on assumptions that were crumbling. Cynthia Blackwood was circling like a shark who smelled blood in the water. And somewhere out there, someone with resources was digging into secrets I'd spent years protecting. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. We should meet. I have information you need to hear. CB. Cynthia Blackwood had apparently decided that subtlety was no longer necessary. I showed the text to David, whose face went through another series of expressions before settling on resignation. She knows, doesn't she? He said quietly. About your money. About everything. Cynthia's always been clever, I replied. And desperate people are often the most dangerous. Margaret was crying again, but these weren't the theatrical tears of the night before. These were the quiet tears of someone who realized they'd set a catastrophe in motion. What have I done? She whispered. You've reminded me why I kept my real life separate from this family, I said, not unkindly but without softening the truth. You've shown me that my instincts about protecting myself were correct. David stood up abruptly, pacing to the window, where he stared out at the snow-covered grounds of the estate that had never really been his. I need to think, he said finally. About everything. About us. About what happens next. Take all the time you need, I replied. But understand that while you're thinking, other people are acting. Cynthia's making her move. Your firm is questioning your position. Someone's investigating my background. And your mother's Facebook posts are creating consequences that we'll all have to live with. I gathered the documents from the counter, sliding them back into their folder. I'm going to my office for a few hours. I have damage control to orchestrate and security measures to implement. Your office? Jennifer asked. The one in the city. The corner office on the 42nd floor of the building I own. I looked around at their shocked faces one more time. You know, the one David thinks belongs to someone else. I walked toward the kitchen door, pausing at the threshold. David, when you're done thinking, you'll need to make a choice. Not just about our marriage, but about who you want to be. The man who built a life with his successful wife, or the man who needs to be more successful than the woman he's with. And if I choose wrong? He asked quietly. I thought about the prenup that would protect my assets, about the lawyers who could arrange a divorce that would leave him with exactly what he'd contributed to our marriage, nothing. I thought about the job I could take away. With a single phone call, the lifestyle that would evaporate the moment I stopped funding it, but mostly, I thought about the woman I'd been before I married him, and the woman I was ready to become again. Then you'll discover what your life looks like without the safety net you never knew you had, I said simply. The silence that followed me out of the kitchen was heavy with the weight of choices unmade and consequences already in motion. Christmas Day was shaping up to be anything but peaceful. The 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower was silent except for the hum of servers in my private data center. I'd built this sanctuary 7 years ago, long before I met David, as a place where I could operate without pretense or apology. Floor-to-ceiling bulletproof glass offered a panoramic view of the city, while hidden surveillance systems monitored every approach to my executive suite. Marcus was waiting when I arrived, his usually composed expression tight with concern. Spread across my conference table were printouts, photographs, and documents that made my blood run cold. "How bad is it?" I asked, dropping into my chair and accepting the espresso he'd prepared. "Worse than we initially thought," he said, pulling up a chair across from me. "The investigation into your identity didn't start 3 hours ago. It started 3 months ago." I set down my cup, ice crystallizing in my veins. "Explain." Marcus activated the wall-mounted display, showing a timeline that made my stomach drop. October 15th. First database query into Elena Vasquez. October 23rd. Property searches focusing on your residential holdings. November 8th. Corporate filings cross-referenced with your shell companies. "Someone's been hunting me for months," I breathed, studying the methodical progression of the investigation. "It gets worse." Marcus pulled up a series of photographs that made me stand abruptly. "These were taken outside your house. Someone's been conducting physical surveillance." The images showed me leaving for work, David's morning routine, even Margaret's visits. Whoever was investigating me hadn't just been digital, they'd been watching my life unfold in real time. "Who?" The word came out as a whisper. Marcus hesitated, then pulled up a financial document that made everything click into place with the precision of a perfectly executed hostile takeover. The investigation was commissioned by Blackwood Industries. Specifically, by Charles Blackwood, Cynthia's father. The room spun slightly as I processed the implications. "He knows. More than knows. Elena, Charles Blackwood has been targeting you specifically. This wasn't random financial curiosity, this was corporate espionage designed to identify your vulnerabilities." I sank back into my chair as Marcus continued his briefing. 3 months ago, Blackwood Industries was facing bankruptcy. Then suddenly, they received a massive cash infusion from an anonymous investor. The same week, they hired Sterling Investigations, the firm that's been tracking you. "He's been planning this," I said, my mind racing through the possibilities. The investigation, Cynthia's sudden interest in David, Margaret's perfectly timed social media meltdown. This wasn't coincidence. Marcus nodded grimly. "It appears Charles Blackwood discovered your identity months ago and has been orchestrating a campaign to destabilize your marriage and position his daughter as David's alternative." I walked to the windows, staring down at the city that sprawled below like a chessboard where I'd suddenly realized I was playing defense instead of offense. "Show me everything." For the next hour, Marcus laid out a conspiracy that was breathtaking in its scope and audacity. Charles Blackwood hadn't just investigated me, he'd been manipulating my life from the shadows for months. The charity gala where Margaret had made particularly cutting remarks about my simple background. Cynthia had been there, offering sympathy. And suggesting that David deserved someone who understood his world better. The country club incident where I'd been seated at the wrong table, away from David's business associates. Charles Blackwood was on the club's board of directors. Even Margaret's escalating hostility over the past few months had been carefully cultivated through a series of social encounters with Helen, her sister, who had apparently been fed carefully crafted gossip about my suspicious financial habits. "He's been playing a long game," I said, feeling a grudging admiration for the strategy even as it terrified me. "Isolate me from David's family, make me seem increasingly unsuitable, position Cynthia as the better alternative." "And it almost worked," Marcus added. "If Margaret hadn't pushed quite so hard last night, if you hadn't finally revealed the truth about your wealth, David might have gradually distanced himself from you and turned to Cynthia for comfort." My phone rang. David, calling for the first time since I'd left the house. "Elena," his voice was strained. "We need to talk. Something's happened." "I'm listening." "Cynthia came to the house. She's here now. With documents. About you." I closed my eyes, feeling the trap Charles Blackwood had spent months setting finally spring shut. "What kind of documents?" "Financial records. Corporate filings. Elena, she knows everything about your business. She says her father wants to meet with you." "I'll bet he does." I looked at Marcus, who was already pulling up Charles Blackwood's file on his tablet. "David, listen to me very carefully. Do not discuss anything else with Cynthia. Do not sign anything, agree to anything, or make any commitments. And most importantly, don't let her leave with any information about our personal situation. She's not asking for information, David said quietly. She's offering it. About you. About things she says you've hidden from me. What things? She says you've been married before. That your first husband died under suspicious circumstances. That there are questions about your business practices that could destroy both our reputations. The accusations hit me like physical blows, not because they were true, but because they were so cleverly crafted to exploit David's deepest insecurities about our relationship. David, I said, fighting to keep my voice steady, I've never been married before. You know that. We applied for our marriage license together. She has documents, she has fabricated documents designed to make you doubt me, I interrupted. This is exactly what Charles Blackwood has been planning for months. There was silence on the other end of the line. Elena, David finally said. If you've been lying about being married before, what else have you lied about? And there it was, the seed of doubt that Charles Blackwood had been so carefully planting. Even faced with obvious manipulation, David was choosing to believe the worst about me rather than trust the woman he'd claimed to love for 5 years. I'm coming home, I said. Elena, wait, I hung up and turned to Marcus. Cancel all my meetings. For the rest of the week. And get Patricia on the line. If Charles Blackwood wants to play hardball, he's about to discover why I've built the most successful private equity firm on the East Coast. The drive home took 30 minutes, during which Patricia briefed me on Charles Blackwood's vulnerabilities. The anonymous investor who'd saved his company from bankruptcy? That had been me, operating through a shell company, as part of a completely unrelated acquisition strategy. I owned 15% of Blackwood Industries without Charles realizing it. The SEC investigation into his securities fraud? I'd triggered that 18 months ago when I discovered irregularities in a company I was considering acquiring. Charles Blackwood had been stealing from his own investors to maintain his lifestyle. Elena, Patricia's voice crackled through the car's speakers, you have enough evidence to destroy him completely. Why haven't you moved against him before now? Because I didn't know he was targeting me personally, I replied, taking the turn into my driveway. That changes everything. Cynthia's silver Porsche was parked in my circular drive like a declaration of war. Through the windows of my own house, I could see her animated conversation with David while Margaret, Jennifer, and Robert listened with rapt attention. I sat in my car for a moment, planning my approach. Charles Blackwood had spent months orchestrating this confrontation, but he'd made one crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed I would react defensively to his daughter's accusations. Instead, I was about to show him the difference between old money's entitled maneuvering and new money's ruthless efficiency. I walked into my house to find Cynthia Blackwood holding court in my living room, documents spread across my coffee table. Like evidence at a trial. She looked up when I entered, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. Elena, she said warmly, as if we were old friends. I was just sharing some interesting information with David about your background. I'm sure you were. I moved to the liquor cabinet, my liquor cabinet, and poured myself a scotch. Would you like a drink, Cynthia? We should toast your father's impressive investigation into my private life. The room went silent. Cynthia's confident expression faltered slightly. I don't know what you mean, she said carefully. Of course you do. I settled into my armchair, the $15,000 piece Margaret had been admiring earlier, and smiled. Sterling investigations. 3 months of surveillance. Corporate espionage designed to identify my vulnerabilities and position you as David's better alternative. David stared at me in confusion. Elena, what are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that your childhood friend's father has been orchestrating a campaign to destroy our marriage so his daughter can marry you and access the wealth he thinks you control. Cynthia's face had gone pale, but she rallied quickly. That's ridiculous. I'm here as a friend, concerned about David's well-being. These documents prove that you've been deceiving him about fundamental aspects of your identity. Show me, I said calmly. She slid a marriage certificate across the coffee table. According to the document, Elena Vasquez had married Miguel Santos in 2018, and he had died in a car accident 6 months later, leaving her a substantial inheritance. It was expertly forged and completely fabricated. Interesting, I said, studying the document. Tell me, Cynthia, how much did your father pay to have this created? Elena, David's voice was strained. If this is real, it's not real, David. I pulled out my phone and showed him my driver's license history, my passport records, my complete lack of any previous marriage documentation. But what is real is that Charles Blackwood has been investigating me for months, manipulating our family dynamics, and using his daughter to position herself as your alternative when our marriage collapsed under the pressure he was creating. I turned to Cynthia, who was now visibly uncomfortable. The question is, how much did you know about Daddy's plan? Were you a willing conspirator, or just his unwitting puppet? Cynthia's mask finally slipped, revealing something cold and calculating beneath her sympathetic facade. David deserves better than a woman who's built her life on lies. Which woman would that be? I asked. The one who's never been married before, or the one whose family fortune evaporated 3 years ago in a series of spectacularly bad investments? The color drained from her face completely. That's right, Cynthia. I know about your family's financial situation. I know about your father's SEC investigation. And most interestingly, I know about the anonymous investor who saved Blackwood Industries from bankruptcy 3 months ago. I stood up, moving to the window where I could see both her reaction and David's growing comprehension. That investor was me, Cynthia. I own 15% of your father's company. The same company that's been paying Sterling Investigations to spy on me. The silence that followed was absolute. Which means, I continued, turning back to face the room, your father has been using my own money to finance an investigation designed to destroy my marriage so you could take my place. The implications hit everyone simultaneously. Charles Blackwood had been so focused on targeting me that he'd never realized he was already in business with me. His daughter's romantic ambitions were being funded by the very woman she was trying to replace. Cynthia stood abruptly, gathering her fabricated documents with hands that shook slightly. This conversation is over. Is it? I asked pleasantly. Because I think it's just getting interesting. Patricia, are you still on the line? My lawyer's voice filled the room through my phone speaker. I'm here, Elena. And I have some fascinating news about Mr. Blackwood's SEC investigation. Cynthia froze halfway to the door. It seems there's been a breakthrough in the case, Patricia continued. New evidence has come to light about securities fraud, embezzlement, and misuse of investor funds. The DOJ is preparing to file criminal charges. I looked directly at Cynthia. Evidence I provided, using information I gathered as a concerned investor in Blackwood Industries. The trap Charles Blackwood had spent months setting had just become his own prison, and his daughter was about to discover that targeting Elena Vasquez had been the biggest mistake of their lives. The sound of Cynthia's heels clicking frantically across my marble foyer was drowned out by the thunderous silence that followed Patricia's revelation. Through the window, I watched her fumble with her car keys, her composed facade finally cracking under the weight of her father's spectacular miscalculation. David stood frozen in the center of the room, the forged marriage certificate still clutched in his hands like evidence of a crime he couldn't quite comprehend. Margaret had sunk back into the sofa, her face cycling through expressions of horror, confusion, and dawning realization. Jennifer and Robert exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their sudden understanding of just how far out of their depth they'd all been swimming. Elena, David's voice came out as a croak. I need to understand what just happened here. I walked to the bar cart and refilled my scotch, taking my time to let the full implications settle over everyone. What happened, David, is that you just discovered your childhood friend's family has been treating our marriage like a corporate takeover they could manipulate from the outside. But the documents are forgeries, I said firmly. Expensive ones, professionally created, but fabrications nonetheless. Your friend Cynthia just tried to convince you that your wife of 5 years has been lying about her entire identity, using documents her father paid to have manufactured. Margaret found her voice first. Elena, I don't understand. Why would Charles Blackwood go to such lengths? What could he possibly gain? I looked at her, really looked at her, this woman who had spent years treating me like an unwelcome intrusion into her family's perfect narrative. He thought David controlled my money, Margaret. He spent months investigating my finances, discovered I was worth billions, and assumed that as my husband, David had access to that wealth. The cruel irony wasn't lost on any of us. Charles Blackwood's elaborate scheme was based on the same fundamental misunderstanding that had poisoned my relationship with David's family from the beginning, the assumption that successful women must be dependent on their husbands rather than the other way around. So he orchestrated this whole thing to get Cynthia married to David so she could access what he thought was David's fortune, Robert said slowly, working through the logic. Exactly. Except it was never David's fortune to begin with. I moved to the window, watching Cynthia's Porsche disappear down the driveway like a silver bullet fired in retreat. Charles Blackwood spent months and tens of thousands of dollars trying to steal money that belonged to me, using my own investment in his company to finance the operation. David finally set down the forged documents, his hands shaking slightly. Elena, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Haven't I been honest enough for one Christmas? I replied, but there was no humor in my voice. When Cynthia was showing us those documents, when she was telling us about your supposed first marriage and the suspicious circumstances around your husband's death. He paused, swallowing hard. For just a moment, I believed her. I was ready to believe that you'd been lying to me about everything. The admission hit me like a physical blow, not because it was surprising, but because it confirmed my deepest fears about our relationship. I see, I said quietly. Do you? David stepped closer, his eyes searching my face. Do you understand what it felt like to discover that my wife has been living a completely different life than the one I thought we shared? To realize that every conversation we've had about money, about career struggles, about our future together has been based on a lie. I understand, I said, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest, that you were more willing to believe I was a liar and potentially a murderer than to trust that I might have had good reasons for protecting my privacy. The words hung between us like a bridge neither of us was prepared to cross. Margaret, in a rare moment of insight, stood up quietly. Jennifer, Robert, I think we should give them some privacy. No, I said firmly, stopping them at the doorway. Stay. This conversation involves all of you, because this marriage involves all of you. That's been part of the problem from the beginning. I turned back to David, feeling the weight of 5 years of careful pretense finally lifting from my shoulders. You want honesty? Here's honesty. I hid my wealth from you because every man I dated before you saw dollar signs instead of me. I presented myself as struggling financially because I wanted to know if you could love Elena the person, not Elena the billionaire. But you let me think I was providing for you because you needed to think that. The words exploded out of me with years of pent-up frustration. From our very first date, you positioned yourself as my protector, my guide into a better life. You introduced me to your family as your project, someone you were helping to improve and elevate. David's face went pale. I never said that. You didn't have to say it. It was in every gesture, every conversation, every time you explained things to me that I already knew better than you did. I moved closer to him, my voice dropping to a whisper. Do you remember our third date, when you took me to that expensive restaurant and insisted on ordering the wine because you knew more about these things? He nodded reluctantly. That wine was from a vineyard I owned. I sat there smiling and grateful while my husband-to-be explained my own product to me because that's what you needed, to be the expert, the successful one, the one with something to offer. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret, to her credit, was the first to speak. Elena, we had no idea you felt that way. Didn't you? I turned to face her directly. Margaret, in 5 years of family gatherings, how many times did you ask me about my work? My interests? My opinions on anything that mattered? She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. I'll tell you how many times, I continued. 0. Instead, you spent 5 years giving me advice about how to support David's career, how to be the kind of wife he deserves, how to appreciate what I had with him. Jennifer was crying now, quiet tears of recognition. Elena, we thought we were helping you fit in. You thought you were managing me, I corrected. All of you. You created a version of me that fit your narrative about David's success and my good fortune, and then you spent years trying to force me to conform to that fiction. I walked to the mantelpiece where our wedding photos sat in an expensive silver frame, a frame I'd bought, like everything else in this house. In the picture, we looked happy, hopeful, deeply in love. I wondered if that couple had ever really existed or if we'd both been playing roles from the very beginning. The tragedy, I said, still looking at the photograph, is that I convinced myself this was love. I told myself that David's need to feel superior was just masculine insecurity that I could work around. I thought if I made myself small enough, grateful enough, dependent enough, he would eventually see me for who I really was and love that person too. Elena, David's voice was barely audible. I do love you. I turned to face him, this man I'd rearranged my entire life to accommodate. Do you? Do you love me, or do you love the idea of being married to someone who needs you? The question hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Because here's what I've realized, I continued. When Cynthia walked in here with her fabricated documents, your first instinct wasn't to defend your wife or question her motives. Your first instinct was to believe that I was capable of lying to you about fundamental aspects of my identity. David's eyes filled with tears. Elena, I was confused. The documents looked so real, and after discovering you'd hidden your wealth from me, I didn't hide my wealth from you, David. I protected it. From exactly this kind of situation, where my success becomes a problem to be managed rather than an achievement to be celebrated. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia, DOJ moving forward with Blackwood arrests. Charles taken into custody an hour ago. This is over. I read the message aloud, watching as the reality of their situation settled over David's family like snow on a graveyard. Charles Blackwood is going to prison, I said quietly. His company will be liquidated to pay back the investors he defrauded. Cynthia will be facing financial ruin and potential criminal charges as an accessory to her father's schemes. Margaret was shaking her head in disbelief. All of this, because he thought David had access to your money? All of this, I confirmed, because none of you could imagine a world where the woman in the room was the one with real power. The brutal honesty of it settled over us like a shroud. David sank into the chair across from me, his head in his hands. What do we do now? He asked. How do we come back from this? It was the question I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. I don't know if we can, I said honestly. David, for 5 years, I've been playing a role in our marriage. But so have you. You've been playing the successful husband married to his grateful wife. Now that we both know the truth about who we really are, I'm not sure those people can love each other. Are you saying you want a divorce? Jennifer asked quietly. I thought about the prenup David had insisted on, the one that would protect my assets while leaving him with nothing. I thought about the job at the law firm I owned, the lifestyle funded by my companies, the social standing built on my money. I thought about what his life would look like if I walked away, but mostly, I thought about what my life would look like if I stayed. I'm saying, I replied carefully, that we need to decide if we can build something real from the ruins of what we thought we had. David looked up at me, tears streaming down his face. Elena, I know I've made mistakes. We all have. But can't we try to fix this? Can't we start over, knowing the truth this time? Can we? I asked. Can you love a wife who's more successful than you are? Can you celebrate my achievements instead of needing me to celebrate yours? Can you introduce me at parties as Elena Vasquez, CEO, instead of Elena Morrison, David's wife? The questions hung between us like a test neither of us was sure we could pass. I want to try, he said quietly. If you'll let me, I want to try. To be the husband you deserve instead of the husband I thought you needed. I looked around the room at the family who had spent years making me feel like an outsider, who had just discovered that their entire lifestyle depended on the woman they'd dismissed as unworthy. Margaret, crying silent tears of recognition. Jennifer and Robert, finally understanding the scope of their assumptions. David, broken and hopeful and terrified all at once. Then we try, I said finally. But understand this, I'm done pretending to be smaller than I am. I'm done hiding my success to protect your egos. I'm done being grateful for acceptance I should never have had to earn. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was pregnant with possibility, heavy with the weight of choices yet to be made. Outside, snow continued to fall on the grounds of the estate that had always been mine, covering the evidence of yesterday's assumptions under a blanket of tomorrow's uncertainties. The real work of rebuilding, or letting go, was about to begin. 6 months later, the boardroom of Meridian Holdings buzzed with controlled energy as I wrapped up the quarterly presentation to our investors. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan stretched out beneath us like a conquered territory, and for the first time in years, I felt completely at home in my own skin. Questions? I asked, scanning the faces around the mahogany table that had witnessed some of the most significant business decisions of the past decade. Harold Chen, one of our longest-standing investors, raised his hand. Elena, the Reynolds acquisition is performing beyond projections. Your instincts about that management team were spot on. I smiled, remembering how different these meetings used to feel when I rushed back to play the role of struggling accountant for David's benefit. Sometimes the best investments are in people who've been underestimated by others. As the meeting dispersed, Marcus approached with his tablet, and that particular expression that meant important personal business was intersecting with corporate matters. The final documents from the Blackwood liquidation, he said, handing me a folder thick with legal papers. Charles Blackwood's sentencing is next week. The prosecutors are recommending 8 years federal prison. I nodded, feeling no satisfaction in Charles's downfall, just relief that the threat he'd represented was finally neutralized. And Cynthia? Plea bargain accepted. 2 years probation, community service, and full restitution to the investors. Her father defrauded. She's apparently working as a receptionist at a dental office in Cleveland. The contrast with her former life of privilege was stark, but I found I couldn't muster much sympathy. Actions had consequences, and both Blackwoods had learned that lesson the hard way. What about the other matter? I asked, though I already knew the answer from Marcus's carefully neutral expression. The divorce papers were finalized this morning. David's attorney delivered his copies an hour ago. I walked to the windows, looking down at the city where I'd built my empire while pretending to be someone else. The relief I felt was profound and complicated, grief for what we'd lost mixed with liberation at what I'd finally found. The marriage had lasted exactly 3 months after Christmas Day. 3 months of therapy sessions, honest conversations, and the increasingly clear realization that some relationships can't survive the death of their founding illusions. David had tried, genuinely tried, to love the real me. But every business success felt like a personal failure to him. Every time I made a decision about our finances, our home, our future, I could see him shrink a little more. The final straw had come in March, when Forbes had finally connected Elena Vasquez with Elena Morrison and published a cover story about the billionaire who hid in plain sight. David's reaction to seeing his wife celebrated in a major business magazine had been telling, not pride, but embarrassment. Not excitement about sharing in my success, but resentment about being overshadowed by it. The house? I asked Marcus. David moved out last week. He took only what was his from before the marriage, as specified in the prenup. He left a letter. I accepted the envelope, recognizing David's careful handwriting. Inside, a single page. That somehow managed to capture 5 years of complicated love. Elena, I know I can't give you back the years you spent pretending to be someone smaller than you were. I can't undo the damage my family and I did with our assumptions and our need to feel superior. But I can finally tell you the truth I was too proud to admit before. You were always too good for me. Not because of your money, but because of your strength, your intelligence, your capacity to love someone enough to hide your light so they could feel brighter. I spent our entire marriage trying to be worthy of the woman I thought you were, never realizing I was married to someone extraordinary who was pretending to be ordinary for my benefit. I'm sorry it took losing you to understand what I had. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to love all of you from the beginning. But mostly, I'm sorry that loving me cost you so much of yourself. You deserve a partner who celebrates your successes instead of being threatened by them. You deserve a love that makes you bigger, not smaller. Thank you for the gift of being loved by you, even if I was too foolish to recognize it at the time. David *. I folded the letter carefully, feeling the last threads of anger and resentment finally dissolve. David had finally seen me clearly, even if it was too late for us. Ma'am? Marcus's voice pulled me back to the present. There's someone here to see you. She says it's personal. I turned to find Margaret Morrison standing in my office doorway, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. The imperious matriarch who had once screamed at me to leave my own house had been replaced by a woman who seemed genuinely humbled by the consequences of her actions. Margaret, I said, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. This is unexpected. She sat carefully, clutching her purse like a shield. Elena, I know I have no right to be here. No right to ask anything of you after what I did to you, to your marriage. You're right, I said simply. You don't. She flinched but didn't retreat. I need you to know that I've spent every day since Christmas thinking about the way I treated you. The things I said, the assumptions I made, the way I tried to make you feel unwelcome in your own home. And I realized that I destroyed my son's marriage because I couldn't accept that a woman from your background could be more successful than our family. I let my prejudices and my pride blind me to who you really were. I studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or self-serving agenda. Instead, I saw something I'd never expected from Margaret Morrison: genuine remorse. Margaret, what do you want from me? She was quiet for a long moment, tears streaming down her cheeks. I want to apologize. Not because I expect forgiveness, but because you deserve to hear it. I was wrong about you from the beginning. I was cruel, dismissive, and prejudiced. I treated you like an intruder when you were the best thing that ever happened to my son. Yes. I agreed quietly. You did. He's destroyed, you know, she continued. David. He's living in a studio apartment downtown, working as a junior associate at a small firm. He won't accept help from us, won't take anything that he didn't earn himself. He says he needs to learn how to be successful on his own terms. I felt a pang of sympathy for the man I'd once loved. That's probably healthy for him. He talks about you, Margaret said. About how proud he should have been of your success instead of being threatened by it. About how he wishes he could have been the partner you deserved instead of the husband he thought you needed. The conversation was taking a turn I hadn't expected. Margaret, why are you telling me this? She looked directly at me for the first time since entering my office. Because I want you to know that some of us learned from our mistakes. Jennifer has gone back to school for her MBA. She says she wants to understand business better so she never underestimates another woman's intelligence. Robert has started volunteering with organizations that support women entrepreneurs. And you? Margaret smiled, the first genuine smile I'd ever seen from her. I've been working with a therapist to understand my own biases and prejudices. And I've been volunteering at a women's shelter, helping survivors rebuild their lives. It turns out that supporting women instead of tearing them down is much more rewarding than I expected. I leaned back in my chair, processing this transformation in a woman I'd thought was incapable of change. Elena, Margaret said quietly, I know it's too late to save your marriage to David. I know the damage I helped cause can't be undone. But I want you to know that meeting you changed our entire family. We're all better people because of what you taught us about strength, dignity, and grace under pressure. Even though it cost me my marriage? Especially because of that. You showed us what real love looks like, love that's willing to sacrifice for the other person's happiness. You hid your success to protect David's ego. You endured our cruelty to preserve family peace. You gave up pieces of yourself to make us comfortable. She paused, wiping away tears. That's not something we deserved, but it's something we'll never forget. I felt tears welling in my own eyes, not from sadness, but from a sense of completion I hadn't expected. Margaret, I said gently, thank you for coming here. For saying these things. It means more than you know. She stood to leave, then paused at the door. Elena, I know you'll find someone who loves all of you from the beginning. Someone who celebrates your success instead of being diminished by it. You deserve that kind of love. After she left, I sat alone in my office as the Manhattan skyline darkened into evening. The city lights twinkled like stars, each one representing someone else's dreams, struggles, and triumphs. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia, new client consultation tomorrow. Tech startup founded by 3 brilliant women who've been turned down by every major investor because they're too ambitious. Sound familiar? I smiled, feeling the familiar thrill of a new challenge, a new opportunity to prove the doubters wrong. 6 months ago, I'd been a woman hiding in the shadows of her own life, pretending to be smaller than she was to keep peace in a marriage built on illusions. Tonight, I was Elena Vasquez again, completely, authentically, unapologetically myself. The house I'd shared with David had been sold. I'd moved into a penthouse that overlooked Central Park, with glass walls that let in light from every direction. And no corners where shadows could hide. There were no performances to maintain, no roles to play, no pretenses to preserve. For the first time in years, I was completely free to be exactly who I'd always been, a woman who'd built an empire from nothing, who'd proven every doubter wrong, who'd learned that the most expensive lesson in life was sometimes the most valuable one. The intercom buzzed. "Miss Vasquez, your car is ready downstairs." I gathered my things, thinking about the charity gala I was attending tonight, not as someone's plus one, but as the keynote speaker. Tomorrow, I would announce the Elena Vasquez Foundation, dedicated to supporting women entrepreneurs who'd been told they were too ambitious for their own good. As I walked to the elevator, I caught my reflection in the polished steel doors. The woman looking back at me was confident, successful, and utterly authentic. She was someone who'd learned that hiding your light doesn't protect anyone, it just makes the world a little darker. The elevator descended toward the lobby, toward the life I'd chosen to build from the ruins of the one I'd tried so hard to preserve. Some stories end with getting the guy. This one ended with getting myself back, and for the first time in years, that felt like more than enough. It felt like everything. The end. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.